March 9, 1945. 11:47 p.m. Tokyo, Empire of Japan. Lieutenant Commander Toshio Nakamura pressed his binoculars against his eyes, scanning the darkness from the observation platform of the Nakano Air Defense Command Center. The night was unusually clear. Stars scattered across the sky like diamond dust. Below him, Tokyo sprawled in enforced blackout, 8 million souls sleeping in wooden houses, paper screens, and bamboo frames. The city had been lucky. While other Japanese cities had burned under American incendiary attacks, Tokyo had suffered only limited raids. The defenses were strong: 31 anti-aircraft guns, 87 searchlight batteries, and 2 full fighter wings, the 10th and 53rd Air Divisions, ready to scramble at a moment's notice. Nakamura had been on duty since 6 p.m. 6 hours of watching empty skies. 6 hours of waiting for an attack that intelligence insisted was coming. The Americans had been hitting Japanese cities for weeks: Kobe, Nagoya, Osaka, but always in daylight, always with fighter escort, always predictable. Japanese commanders understood daylight bombing. They knew how to respond: intercept at altitude, attack the formations, accept losses, but inflict damage. Night bombing was different. Night bombing required radar technology the Americans supposedly possessed, but had never demonstrated in force over Japan. Japanese intelligence had dismissed the threat. American radar was primitive, they said, unreliable, easily confused by weather, terrain, and electronic countermeasures. The Americans cannot navigate accurately at night. Major General Saizo Arisu, Chief of Intelligence, had briefed them just days earlier. Their bombers will scatter. Their formations will dissolve. Night raids on Tokyo are technically impossible. At 11:51 p.m., the air raid siren began its mournful wail. Nakamura grabbed the telephone connecting him to Central Air Defense. Report: unknown aircraft detected. The controller's voice crackled. Bearing 35 degrees, range 150 kilometers, altitude 5,000 meters. Single contact. 1 bomber. A Pathfinder, perhaps. Nothing to worry about. Nakamura ordered 2 night fighters scrambled. Nakajima J-1N1 Geckos. Twin-engine interceptors equipped with primitive upward-firing cannon. They lifted off from Chofu Airfield at 11:54 p.m., climbing into the darkness. At 11:58 p.m., the second call came. Multiple contacts. Bearing 40 degrees, range 120 kilometers. A pause. Then the controller's voice returned, higher pitched. Sir, the screen is, there are many of them. How many? I count. 30. No, 50. Sir, they're still coming. The entire scope is filled with contacts. Nakamura felt ice settle in his stomach. 50 bombers. That was a major raid. But at night, without fighter escort. The Americans had never update. The controller interrupted. Now reading 100 plus contacts. Correction, 100. They're in a stream formation, sir. Coming in low 1,400 to 2,000 meters. Low altitude. At night. In a stream that stretched for miles. This was no ordinary raid. Scramble all fighters. Nakamura ordered. Sound general alarm. Activate all searchlight batteries. Get me Major General Kawabe immediately. Below, Tokyo began to wake. Air raid sirens howled across 23 wards. Searchlights stabbed into the sky, their beams crossing and recrossing in desperate search patterns. Citizens stumbled from their homes toward designated shelters, though many, exhausted by months of false alarms, simply stayed in bed. At 12:08 a.m., the first American bomber crossed the Tokyo coastline. Through his binoculars, Nakamura saw it, a massive 4-engine aircraft, silver in the searchlight beams, flying at barely 2,000 meters. Insanely low for a strategic bomber. The B-29 Superfortress was designed to operate at 9,000 meters, beyond the reach of most Japanese defenses. Why were they so low? The bomber's bay doors opened. Small objects tumbled out, catching the light as they fell. Not the heavy blockbuster bombs used in daylight raids, but smaller munitions, hundreds of them scattering across the sky like metallic rain. They hit the Shitamachi district, Tokyo's eastern working-class neighborhoods, at 12:09 a.m. Nakamura didn't hear the explosions. What he heard was something far more terrifying, a sound like wind through reeds, building quickly into a roar. The incendiaries had ignited. The M69 cluster bomb was a weapon Japan had never encountered. Each B-29 carried 120 of them, small hexagonal tubes filled with napalm gel, designed to punch through roofs and explode inside buildings. The napalm burned at 1000 degrees Celsius, hot enough to ignite wood, paper, and flesh on contact. Within 2 minutes, 3,000 individual fires were burning across Shitamachi. Second wave inbound, the controller reported, his voice barely audible over the growing chaos. Another 100+ contacts. Third wave behind them. Sir, I'm reading over 300 aircraft total. 300 B-29s, each carrying 7 tons of incendiaries. Over 2,000 tons of napalm about to fall on a city built of wood and paper. Through his binoculars, Nakamura watched the second wave arrive. The bombers came in precise intervals, 60 seconds apart, each one adding its payload to the growing inferno below. They flew straight and level, seemingly unconcerned about the anti-aircraft fire bursting around them, about the searchlights tracking them, about the night fighters attempting desperate intercepts. They flew as if they knew exactly where they were, as if they could see in the dark because they could. What Nakamura didn't know, what Japanese intelligence had catastrophically failed to understand, was that every B-29 was equipped with APQ-13 radar. This ground-mapping radar could identify coastlines, rivers, and urban areas through complete darkness and cloud cover. The Americans weren't guessing where Tokyo was. They were seeing it on glowing green screens in their cockpits, as clearly as if it were daylight. More devastating still was the lead bomber, a specially equipped Pathfinder, with APQ-7 Eagle radar, capable of identifying individual buildings. The Pathfinder had marked the target zone with M47 napalm bombs, giant incendiary markers that created a blazing X, visible for 30 miles. The following bombers didn't need to find Tokyo, they just needed to aim for the fire. By 12:20 a.m., the wind had begun. Tokyo's geography created a natural wind tunnel. Cold air from Tokyo Bay rushed inland, drawn by the rapidly heating air above the fires. The wind accelerated 20 kilometers per hour, then 30, then 50. The individual fires began to merge, fed by hurricane-force winds of their own creation. A firestorm was born. Nakamura watched, paralyzed as the eastern horizon turned orange, then red, then white. The heat was so intense he could feel it, 10 kilometers away, like standing before an open furnace. The smoke column rose 3,000 meters, glowing from within, blocking out the stars. The bombers kept coming. His telephone rang constantly. Reports flooded in, each more desperate than the last. Honjo district is completely engulfed. Fire brigades cannot approach the flames. Sumida River is boiling. People are jumping in and dying. Asakusa is gone. Fukagawa is burning. The fires have jumped the Sumida western wards, now threatened. At 12:45 a.m., a fighter pilot's voice crackled over the radio, high-pitched with desperation. I have one in my sights. Firing hits observed. The bomber is not responding. It continues on course. I'm out of ammunition. The B-29s absorbed punishment that would have destroyed any other aircraft. Their armored fuselages shrugged off 20mm cannon shells. Their self-sealing fuel tanks prevented catastrophic fires. Japanese night fighters, already struggling to find targets in the darkness, discovered that even when they achieved successful intercepts, they couldn't bring the giants down. Meanwhile, the American gunners, guided by radar-directed fire control systems, returned accurate fire even in complete darkness. Japanese fighters fell in flames, their pilots never seeing what killed them. By 1:30 a.m., Nakamura's command center was receiving no reports from Shitamachi. The telephone lines had melted. The observers had fled or died. The entire district, 16 square miles of Tokyo, home to 750,000 people, had become a single unified inferno. At 2:37 a.m., the last B-29 dropped its payload and turned for home. The silence that followed was worse than the bombs. Nakamura stepped outside the command center. The eastern sky glowed like a false dawn, orange and terrible. Ash fell like black snow covering everything. The smell, burning wood, burning flesh, chemicals he couldn't identify, made him gag. Around him, air defense personnel stood motionless, staring at what had been their city. One young radar operator approached, his face streaked with tears and soot. "Sir," he whispered, "how did they do this? How did they find us in complete darkness? How did they navigate so precisely?" Nakamura had no answer. Not then, but as dawn broke over Tokyo, revealing a wasteland of ash and twisted metal where neighborhoods had stood, the truth would become impossible to ignore. The Americans possessed technology Japan had dismissed as primitive. Radar that could map cities through darkness, navigation systems that made night as clear as day, bombing accuracy that turned 3-4 aircraft into surgical instruments of destruction. Japanese intelligence had underestimated American radar, had called it unreliable, had insisted night bombing was impossible, that single miscalculation had just killed 100,000 people in 6 hours. And this was only the beginning. The arrogance had begun 2 years earlier, in April 1943, when Japanese intelligence officers first analyzed captured American radar equipment from Guadalcanal. Captain Minoru Genda, one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most brilliant tacticians and architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, examined the bulky SER-268 coastal defense radar with open disdain. The unit was primitive, vacuum tubes the size of light bulbs, crude cathode ray displays, massive power requirements. "This is what the Americans call advanced technology," Genda remarked to his intelligence staff. "It is large, unwieldy, and requires a truck to transport. Our Type 21 air search radar is superior in every measurable way." The assessment spread through Japanese military leadership like gospel. America, they concluded, had fallen behind in the radar race. While Japan had been perfecting compact, efficient radar systems since 1940, the Americans were still building room-sized contraptions that broke down in tropical humidity. The conclusion seemed supported by evidence. Japanese radar had guided successful night interceptions over the Philippines. The Americans, by contrast, appeared to rely primarily on visual spotting and searchlights, tactics from the previous war. What Japanese intelligence failed to understand was that they were looking at coastal defense radar from 1941, technology already obsolete when captured. The Americans had moved on. By 1943, while Japan was refining existing designs, American laboratories were revolutionizing the entire field. MIT's radiation laboratory employed 4,000 scientists and engineers working on dozens of radar projects simultaneously. They weren't improving radar incrementally, they were reinventing it. The cavity magnetron, developed in Britain and mass-produced in America, generated microwave frequencies that allowed for unprecedented resolution. The Americans could now see individual aircraft, distinguish bombers from fighters, and map terrain features in extraordinary detail. "This is what the Americans call advanced technology," Genda remarked to his intelligence staff. "It is large, unwieldy, and requires a truck to transport. Our Type 21 air search radar is superior in every measurable way." The assessment spread through Japanese military leadership like gospel. America, they concluded, had fallen behind in the radar race. While Japan had been perfecting compact, efficient radar systems since 1940, the Americans were still building room-sized contraptions that broke down in tropical humidity. The conclusion seemed supported by evidence. Japanese radar had guided successful night interceptions over the Philippines. The Americans, by contrast, appeared to rely primarily on visual spotting and searchlights, tactics from the previous war. What Japanese intelligence failed to understand was that they were looking at coastal defense radar from 1941, technology already obsolete when captured. The Americans had moved on. By 1943, while Japan was refining existing designs, American laboratories were revolutionizing the entire field. MIT's Radiation Laboratory employed 4,000 scientists and engineers working on dozens of radar projects simultaneously. They weren't improving radar incrementally, they were reinventing it. The cavity magnetron, developed in Britain and mass-produced in America, generated microwave frequencies that allowed for unprecedented resolution. The Americans could now see individual aircraft, distinguish bombers from fighters, and map terrain features in extraordinary detail. Japan had nothing comparable. Japanese radar operated on longer wavelengths, effective for detecting large formations, but unable to provide the precision necessary for blind bombing or detailed navigation. The Japanese commanders didn't know what they didn't know. In October 1944, when B-29 Superfortresses began operating from the Mariana Islands, Japanese air defense commanders studied their tactics with growing confidence. The Americans bombed from high altitude, 9,000 meters in daylight, with fighter escort when possible. This was conventional strategic bombing, and Japan had developed effective countermeasures. The B-29 is a remarkable aircraft. Admiral Seimu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, told his staff, "Fast, well-armed, heavily armored, but it is still just a bomber. It must fly to its target. It must navigate. It must find its aim point. At night, these tasks become impossibly difficult." The assessment was based on Japan's own experience. Japanese bombers had attempted night raids over Chinese cities and found them ineffective. Formations scattered. Navigation errors caused bombs to fall miles from intended targets. The physical and mental strain on crews was enormous. Night bombing, concluded Major General Saizo Arasue, is a weapon of desperation, not precision. The Americans may attempt it, but they will fail. This confidence was reinforced by early American failures. In November 1944, B-29s attempted high-altitude precision bombing of Japanese aircraft factories. Results were dismal. Cloud cover obscured target. Jet stream winds at altitude, a phenomena American meteorologists didn't yet understand, pushed bombs miles off course. Accuracy was less than 5%. Japanese newspapers celebrated these failures. American superbombers prove ineffective, declared the Asahi Shimbun. Enemy air strategy in disarray. What the Japanese didn't see was the American response to failure. Complete tactical reorganization. In January 1945, Major General Curtis LeMay assumed command of XX-1 Bomber Command in the Marianas. LeMay was a tactician who believed in results over doctrine. When high-altitude precision bombing failed, he didn't make excuses. He changed everything. His innovation was radical. Strip the B-29s of most defensive armament to increase bomb load, fly at night to reduce Japanese fighter effectiveness, attack from low altitude to improve accuracy, and use incendiary bombs to exploit Japan's wooden city. Most revolutionary of all, rely entirely on radar for navigation and bombing. Japanese intelligence learned of these tactical changes through signal intercepts and prisoner interrogations. Their assessment was unanimous. LeMay had lost his mind. The Americans are abandoning their doctrine. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and now served in air defense planning, wrote in a February 1945 report, "They speak of night bombing at low altitude without fighter escort. This violates every principle of strategic aviation. Low-altitude night bombing is suicide," agreed Major General Kawabe Torashiro, commander of Tokyo Air Defense. "Japanese night fighters will massacre them. Our anti-aircraft guns, ineffective at 9,000 meters, will devastate aircraft at 2,000 meters. The Americans are delivering their bombers to us as targets." The Japanese military began preparing for the anticipated slaughter. Night fighter training intensified. Anti-aircraft crews drilled for low-altitude engagement. Searchlight batteries practiced coordination procedures. They were ready. What they weren't ready for was an enemy who could navigate by radar through pitch darkness, with precision exceeding daylight visual bombing. The AN/APQ-13 radar installed in every B-29 was a masterpiece of American engineering. Operating at 3 centimeter wavelength, it could distinguish individual city blocks from 15,000 feet. Rivers appeared as dark lines. Coastlines were knife-sharp. Urban areas showed as bright returns contrasting with dark countryside. The lead Pathfinder bombers carried AN/APQ-7 Eagle radar, even more sophisticated, capable of identifying individual large buildings. A skilled radar operator could pick out Tokyo's Imperial Palace, the Diet Building, or major factories with accuracy measured in meters, not kilometers. But Japanese intelligence had no knowledge of these systems. Their technical espionage network, once formidable, had been shattered by American counterintelligence. The radar equipment they'd captured was years obsolete. They were blind to American technological progress. Even the test raids failed to alert them. On February 25, 1945, 17 B-29s attacked Tokyo in a mixed high-altitude raid that included some radar-guided pathfinders. The raid was moderately successful, but Japanese defenders attributed this to luck and favorable weather. The Americans got lucky with cloud breaks, the after-action report concluded. This does not represent a systematic capability. The systematic capability was exactly what the Americans had developed. In the final days before the March 9th attack, Japanese air defense held a confidence that bordered on complacency. They had 3,300 anti-aircraft guns protecting Tokyo. They had 87 searchlight batteries. They had 2 full fighter divisions. Their defenses were, on paper, formidable. What they didn't have was radar-guided fire control. Japanese anti-aircraft guns relied on optical rangefinders and mechanical calculators, useless in darkness or cloud cover. Their searchlights were manually operated, sweeping blindly unless ground observers spotted aircraft visually. Their night fighters had primitive radar, effective only at close range, unable to provide comprehensive air picture. The Americans, by contrast, had built an integrated system. Radar found the targets. Radar guided the navigation. Radar told bombardiers exactly when to release. The entire operation could be executed in complete darkness, through clouds, in conditions where Japanese defenders were essentially blind. On March 8, one day before the firestorm, Lieutenant Commander Nakamura attended a briefing where Major General Kawabe confidently predicted, "If the Americans are foolish enough to attempt low-altitude night bombing, we will destroy 20% of their force. After 2 such raids, they will abandon the tactic as unsustainable." The calculation was based on Japanese experience and conventional wisdom, but conventional wisdom was about to burn. That evening, as 34 B-29s lifted off from Guam, Tinian and Saipan, each carrying 7 tons of M69 incendiary clusters, Japanese radar operators watched their screens with routine boredom. Night duty was usually quiet. American bombers rarely flew at night, and when they did, they came in small numbers. At 11:51 p.m., when the first radar contact appeared 50 kilometers from Tokyo, the operator noted it casually. Single aircraft. Probably a reconnaissance flight. Nothing unusual. He had no way of knowing that behind that single pathfinder, stretched across 90 miles of Pacific darkness, came a stream of bombers guided by radar so precise they would place their incendiaries within a 3-mile target box, despite never seeing the ground. The Japanese had dismissed American radar as primitive. They had concluded that night bombing was tactically impossible. They had prepared to defend against an enemy fighting by their rules. They were about to discover that the Americans had written new rules written in radar waves and fire. The technological revolution that would devastate Tokyo began not in America, but in a secret British laboratory in February. 2 physicists, John Randall and Harry Boot, working at the University of Birmingham, perfected the cavity magnetron, a device that would transform radar from crude detection tool into precision instrument. The magnetron generated microwave frequencies at wavelength measured in centimeters rather than meters, allowing radar resolution previously thought impossible. Britain, desperate and alone after Dunkirk, made a fateful decision: share the technology with America. In September 1940, the Tizard mission, named for physicist Henry Tizard, carried a single-cavity magnetron across the Atlantic in a locked metal box. American scientists who examined it called it the most valuable cargo ever brought to our shore. One historian would later write that the cavity magnetron was worth more to the Allied war effort than 10 divisions. The Americans didn't just adopt the technology, they industrialized it. By 1943, the radiation laboratory at MIT, hastily established in a former underwear factory, employed 4,000 scientists, engineers, and technicians. They weren't refining existing radar, they were inventing entirely new applications: airborne intercept radar, ground mapping radar, radar-guided bomb sights, radar altimeters, radar navigation systems. Production scaled at American speed. Western Electric, Raytheon, and General Electric manufactured cavity magnetrons by the millions. By 1945, American factories were producing more radar sets in a month than Japan had built during the entire war. The AN/AFQ-13 radar installed in B-29 Superfortresses represented the cutting edge of this revolution. Operating at 3 cm wavelength with a rotating antenna scanning 360 degrees, it could map terrain from 20,000 feet with resolution of 500 feet. Cities appeared as bright clusters, rivers showed as dark lines. Coastlines were unmistakable. But the true breakthrough was the AN/AFQ-7 Eagle radar carried by Pathfinder aircraft. This system, operating at 1.25 cm wavelength, achieved resolution of 100 feet, fine enough to distinguish individual large buildings. A skilled radar operator could identify Tokyo's Imperial Palace, locate the Sumida River's distinctive bends, and mark specific industrial districts for bombing. Japanese radar development had followed a completely different path. Constrained by limited industrial capacity and conservative military doctrine, Japan focused on incremental improvements to existing systems rather than revolutionary innovation. The Type 21 air search radar, Japan's most advanced system in 1945, operated at 1.5 meter wavelength, 50 times longer than American microwave radar. It could detect large formations at 100 kilometers, but provided no detail beyond approximate direction and distance. It couldn't distinguish individual aircraft, couldn't map terrain, couldn't guide precision attacks. More critically, Japan lacked the industrial infrastructure to mass-produce even these inferior systems. By March 1945, the entire Japanese home islands were defended by approximately 200 operational radar sets of all types. The Marianas-based B-29 force alone operated with over 600 airborne radar systems. The numbers told the story of two nations' industrial capacity. America had devoted massive resources to radar research and production, treating it as strategically decisive. Japan had treated radar as one tool among many, never prioritizing it sufficiently to achieve technological parity. The B-29 Superfortress itself was a manifestation of American industrial ambition. Each aircraft cost $63,900. 3 times the price of a B-17 Flying Fortress. The development program cost $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project. Boeing's production lines in Wichita, Renton, and Omaha delivered 3,070 B-29s between 1943 and 1945, nearly 4,000 of the most complex aircraft ever built, each one a flying radar station. Japanese aircraft production, hampered by material shortages and Allied bombing, managed 5,074 aircraft of all types in all of 1944, barely more than American B-29 production alone. But quantity without quality was meaningless. The Boeing engineers had designed the B-29 from the beginning as a platform for radar-guided operations. The bombardier's position included a radar scope, integrated with the Norden bombsight. The navigator had separate radar display for terrain mapping. The aircraft commander could monitor both. Training reflected this technological sophistication. American radar operators attended 12-week courses at Boca Raton, Florida, learning to interpret radar returns, distinguish real targets from ground clutter, and coordinate with navigators and bombardiers. They practiced on specialized trainers that simulated various terrain types and weather conditions. Japanese radar operators, when they received training at all, learned through brief technical familiarization and on-the-job experience. No systematic training program existed, no standardized procedures. Each unit developed its own methods, its own interpretations, its own limitations. The incendiary bombs themselves represented American industrial chemistry at its peak. The M69 cluster bomb, the weapon that would incinerate Tokyo, was developed specifically to exploit Japan's wooden urban construction. Each M69 weighed 6 pounds and contained jellied gasoline napalm. Upon impact, a white phosphorus charge ignited the napalm, which burned at 1,000 degrees Celsius and adhered to whatever it touched. Water couldn't extinguish it. Attempts to smother it only spread the burning gel. The M69s were packaged in E-46 cluster bombs, each containing 38 individual incendiaries. These clusters opened at 2,000 feet, scattering their contents across a wide area. A single B-29 carrying 40 clusters released 1,520 individual incendiaries and 520 separate fires from one aircraft. The mathematics were devastating. On March 9, 34 B-29s carried 96,000 individual M69 incendiaries. If even 50% functioned properly, and testing showed 70% effectiveness, that meant 248,000 separate fires igniting across a 3-square-mile target area within 2 hours. No fire service in the world could respond to 250,000 simultaneous fires. Japanese civil defense had prepared for conventional high-explosive bombing. Citizens were trained to fight fires with water buckets, sand, and beating blankets. Neighborhood associations drilled regularly. Tokyo maintained 8,000 firefighters and 1,117 fire engines. None of it mattered against napalm delivered in those quantities. The M69 was designed to penetrate roofs and explode inside buildings, starting fires in attics and upper floors where firefighters couldn't reach them quickly. By the time flames became visible from the street, the building was already lost. The targeting strategy reflected months of detailed intelligence work. American analysts had studied Tokyo's layout, identifying Shitamachi, the working-class eastern wards, as optimal for firestorm generation. The district's characteristics were ideal: wooden construction, narrow streets, high population density, limited fire breaks, and prevailing winds from Tokyo Bay that would drive flames inland. Colonel Robert McNamara, serving with the Statistical Analysis Division, had calculated that attacking Shitamachi would achieve maximum casualties per ton of bombs dropped. The analysis was coldly mathematical: wooden buildings per square mile, population density, prevailing wind patterns, distance between structures, water availability for firefighting. The conclusion was inescapable. A concentrated incendiary attack on Shitamachi would create a self-sustaining firestorm that civil defense couldn't stop. General Curtis LeMay approved the plan despite its revolutionary nature. Strip defensive guns from the B-29s to increase bomb load by 6. Attack at night to reduce Japanese fighter effectiveness. Fly at 5,000–7,000 feet, low enough for accurate radar bombing, high enough to avoid most small arms fire. Use radar-guided pathfinders to mark the target with napalm, creating a beacon visible for 50 miles. The tactics violated every principle of strategic bombing doctrine: no fighter escort, no defensive armament. Low altitude over heavily defended targets. Night operations requiring total reliance on radar navigation. It was radical, unprecedented, and if Japanese intelligence was correct about American radar capabilities, suicidal. But LeMay had access to intelligence Japanese commanders lacked. He knew exactly what American radar could do. He'd seen the test result. He'd studied the radar mapping photos of Japanese cities. He knew his bombardiers could hit a 3-mile target box in pitch darkness through cloud cover. Japanese defenders, preparing to massacre low-flying bombers with anti-aircraft fire, and night fighters, didn't know they would be fighting blind. Their searchlights would find nothing. Their fighters would chase radar ghosts. Their guns would fire at aircraft they couldn't see, couldn't track, couldn't hit. The final element was meteorological. American weather reconnaissance aircraft, themselves equipped with sophisticated radar, had identified March 9th as optimal. Strong winds aloft would speed the bombers to target. Clear skies over Tokyo would allow radar to function perfectly. Low humidity would enhance fire spread. At 5:36 p.m. on March 9th, the first B-29 piloted by Captain Robert Fitzgerald in the Pathfinder Straight Flush lifted off from Northfield, Guam. Behind him at 1-minute intervals 300 and 343 more Superfortresses thundered down runways on Guam, Tinian and Saipan. Each carried 7 tons of M69 incendiaries. Each crew had been briefed on the radar navigation plan. Each bombardier had studied radar photos of Tokyo until he could recognize landmarks on the scope. They flew north into darkness, guided by radar beacons from islands conquered at terrible cost. Saipan, Tinian, Iwo Jima. They flew toward a city whose defenders expected them, prepared for them, and were confident they could defeat them. The defenders were about to learn that modern war wasn't won by courage or tactics alone. It was won by technology, industry, and the ruthless application of scientific warfare. Tokyo was about to become a laboratory for measuring exactly how much destruction radar-guided bombing could achieve. The experiment would last 6 hours. 12:15 a.m. March 10, 1945. Pathfinder Straight Flush, over Tokyo Bay. Captain Robert Fitzgerald studied the green glow of his AN/APQ-7 radar scope, watching the coastline of Japan materialize in phosphorescent detail. The Boso Peninsula appeared as a bright hook of land curving into darkness. Tokyo Bay showed as empty black space. And there, unmistakable, the Sonida River's distinctive path through the city's eastern districts. Target acquired, Fitzgerald announced calmly. Beginning marking run. His bombardier, Lieutenant Frank Armbrust, hunched over his scope, cross-referencing the radar image against the practiced photographs they'd studied for days. The Imperial Palace showed clearly a dark rectangle of parkland surrounded by the bright return of dense urban construction. 2 miles east, the Sonida River bisected the target zone. Bombay doors open, Armbrust reported, releasing markers in 3, 2, 1, bombs away. 50 M47 napalm bombs tumbled from Straight Flush, each one a 100-pound drum of jellied gasoline that would burn for 40 minutes with a flame visible for 50 miles. They fell in a perfect line across Chitamachi, igniting on impact to create a blazing X marking the target zone. Behind Fitzgerald, spread across 90 miles of Pacific darkness, 300 and 300 and 300 neighbors set their course toward the fires. On the ground, Lieutenant Commander Nakamura watched the Pathfinder markers ignite with a sinking feeling he couldn't articulate. The fires formed a pattern too precise, too deliberate. This wasn't random bombing. This was marking, like hunters driving game toward waiting guns. All searchlight batteries illuminate Sector East, he ordered. Night fighters, engage the lead aircraft. 87 searchlights stabbed into the sky, their beams crossing and recrossing in desperate search patterns. They found nothing. The Pathfinder had already turned away, climbing back to altitude, its mission complete. Then the main force arrived. At 12:08 a.m., the first wave of B-29's 60 aircraft in a precise stream began their bombing runs. They came in at 5,000 feet, low enough that Nakamura could hear their engines, could see their silhouettes briefly when searchlights swept past. The bomb bay doors of the lead aircraft opened, clusters tumbled out, dark shapes against the searchlight beams. At 2,000 feet, the clusters burst open, scattering 38 incendiaries each. Hundreds of small shapes rained down across Chitamachi. The M69s punched through tile roofs, through wooden ceilings, into the attics and upper floors of wooden homes. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then white phosphorus charges ignited, and napalm gel exploded into flame at 1000 degrees Celsius. Within 60 seconds, 3,000 separate fires were burning. Nakamura grabbed his field telephone. Fire brigades to Shitamachi immediately. All units respond. But even as he gave the order, he knew it was hopeless. The fires were spreading faster than men could run. The narrow streets designed for foot traffic and handcarts were impassable to modern fire engines. And above, the bombers kept coming. The second wave arrived at 12:10 a.m., then the third at 12:12. They came in a precisely timed stream, each aircraft releasing its payload exactly 60 seconds after the previous one. The bombing accuracy was extraordinary. Nearly every cluster fell within the 3-mile target box marked by the Pathfinder fire. Japanese anti-aircraft guns fired desperately into the darkness. Searchlights swept the sky, but coordinating fire control without radar was nearly impossible. Gunners aimed by sound, by searchlight glimpses, by desperate guesswork. Their shells burst harmlessly around aircraft they couldn't track accurately. The B-29s, guided by radar that showed them exactly where they were relative to the target, flew straight and level, seemingly unconcerned by the barrage below. At 12:23 a.m., Captain Kozaburo Yasui led a flight of 4 Nakajima J-1N1 Gecko night fighters toward the bomber stream. His aircraft was equipped with Type 2 air-to-air radar, effective range 400 meters. He needed to get very close to acquire a target. Contact, his radar operator called out. Bearing 030, range 600 meters. Closing, Yasui pushed his throttle forward, climbing toward the unseen target. At 350 meters, he got visual acquisition, a massive B-29 silhouette against the glow of fires below. He triggered his upward-firing 20mm cannons, saw tracers arc into the bomber's belly, saw hits sparkle along the fuselage. The B-29 didn't waver. It continued straight and level, dropping its incendiaries precisely on target, then banked away, trailing a thin stream of smoke. Yasui fired again, exhausting his ammunition. The bomber still flew, its self-sealing fuel tanks and armored construction absorbing punishment that would have destroyed 3 Japanese bombers. Then the B-29's tail gunner returned fire, radar directed, accurate even in complete darkness. Yasui's wingman exploded in a ball of flame. No parachute emerged. "Break off," Yasui ordered, diving away from the stream. His fuel was already at 40%. He'd fired all his ammunition. He'd achieved 1 damaged bomber, probably. Behind him, the stream continued unabated. By 12:35 a.m., the individual fires in Shitamachi had begun to merge. The heat generated massive updrafts that drew cold air in from Tokyo Bay at increasing velocity. Wind speeds at ground level reached 30 kilometers per hour, then 40, then 50. The firestorm had begun to feed itself. Nakamura received the first civilian casualty reports at 12:41 a.m. The numbers were incomprehensible. Entire neighborhoods gone, fire brigades unable to approach the flames, citizens fleeing toward the Sumida River, only to find the water itself beginning to boil from the heat. "Sir, we're receiving reports that people jumping into the river are being scalded alive," a staff officer reported, his voice breaking. "The bridges are collapsing from the heat. Thousands are trapped." The telephone line went dead. The switching station in Honjo had melted. Above the inferno, the B-29 crews witnessed something beyond their planning, beyond their calculations. Technical Sergeant Chester Marshall, flight engineer on Destiny's Tot, watched through the navigator's window as they made their bombing run at 5,200 feet. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "The whole goddamn city is burning." The fires below had merged into a single sea of flame stretching for miles. The updrafts were so powerful they buffeted the B-29s like toys, lifting them hundreds of feet despite their 140,000-pound weight. The heat was so intense that crews at 6,000 feet could smell burning flesh through their aircraft. "Bombardier, you see the target?" the pilot called. "Target?" the bombardier replied. "There's nothing left to target. It's all on fire. Drop on the markers anyway. That's the plan. They dropped. So did 302 other B-29s over the next 2 hours, each adding its payload to the firestorm below, each crew witnessing destruction on a scale they'd never imagined. At 1:15 a.m., Major General Kawabe reached the Air Defense Command Center, having driven through streets now choked with fleeing refugees. He took one look at the eastern horizon, glowing white-orange, visible for 50 miles, and understood immediately that something unprecedented was occurring. Damage assessment, he demanded. Nakamura handed him the reports. What few they'd received before communications collapsed. Sir, we estimate Honjo Ward is completely destroyed. Fukugawa is 90% destroyed. Asakusa is burning uncontrollably. The fires have jumped the Sumida River and are spreading west into Kanda and Nihonbashi. Casualties? Unknown, sir. Communications with most civil defense posts in the affected areas have ceased. Fire brigade commanders report. They report that firefighting is impossible. The heat is too intense. They cannot approach within 100 meters of the fires. Kawabe stared at the map, at the red hatching that now covered 16 square miles of Tokyo. How many bombers? We estimate 300, possibly more. They came in a continuous stream for nearly 2 hours. Our fighters claimed 4 destroyed, possibly 8. Our anti-aircraft guns may have damaged 20. But sir, they kept coming. No matter what we threw at them, they kept coming, and every single one found the target. That last detail struck Kawabe with the force of revelation. Every aircraft had bombed accurately, in complete darkness, through smoke so thick it should have been impossible to see anything. They hadn't scattered, they hadn't missed, they hadn't become disoriented. They can see, he said quietly. Their radar, it allows them to navigate as if it were daylight. Nakamura nodded. That's the only explanation, sir. They flew straight to the target, bombed with precision, and flew away. Our searchlights found almost nothing. Our fighters rarely achieved visual contact. They were invisible, but they could see everything. The implications were staggering. If the Americans could bomb with this accuracy at night, then no Japanese city was safe. Day or night, clear weather or clouds, it didn't matter. The radar made them invulnerable to weather, to darkness, to the very night itself. At 2:37 a.m., the last B-29 dropped its final cluster and turned for home. The bombers had been over Tokyo for 2.5 hours. They'd dropped 65 tons of incendiaries, 96,000 individual. The cost, 14 B-29s lost. Half to mechanical failure or accident rather than enemy action. The return was devastating. Of 34 aircraft launched, 20 returned safe. A loss rate of 4.2%, high by previous standards, but nowhere near the 20% losses Japanese commanders had predicted for low-altitude night bombing. The Americans had proven that radar-guided night bombing was not only possible but devastatingly effective. As dawn broke on March 10th, the scope of destruction became visible. 16 square miles of Tokyo, 63,000 buildings had been reduced to ash. The firestorm had killed approximately 100,000 people in 6 hours, more than either atomic bomb would kill 4 months later. But the death toll, horrific as it was, wasn't the true measure of Japan's defeat that night. The true defeat was the realization that had settled over every Japanese air defense commander from Hokkaido to Kyushu. They had no answer to radar-guided bombing. Their searchlights were useless. Their fighters were blind. Their anti-aircraft guns couldn't track what they couldn't see. The Americans had fought with rules Japan didn't understand, using technology Japan couldn't match, achieving results Japan couldn't prevent. And it had only just begun. March 11, Imperial General Headquarters, Tokyo. The smell of smoke still hung over the city, as senior military commanders gathered for an emergency assessment. Through the windows of the underground bunker, the sky remained hazy with ash. Civilian authorities reported that the fires in Shitamachi had finally been contained after burning for 14 hours. Prime Minister Kuniaki Kaiso opened the meeting with a question no one wanted to answer. Can this happen again? The silence was profound. Finally, Major General Senor Asue, Chief of Intelligence, spoke. Yes, Your Excellency. Not only can it happen again, it will happen again. The Americans have demonstrated a capability we did not believe existed. Their radar allows precision navigation and bombing in conditions where we are effectively blind. Our defenses? Admiral Seimu Toyoda asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Inadequate, Arasui admitted. We tracked approximately 300 aircraft on radar. We scrambled 1,225 night fighters. We fired over 2,000 anti-aircraft shells. We claimed 14 confirmed shootdowns. The Americans acknowledge losing 14 aircraft, a 4% loss rate. For that cost, they destroyed 16 square miles of Tokyo and killed 100,000 civilians. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. If the Americans could sustain 4% losses while achieving this level of destruction, they could incinerate every major Japanese city within months. What about our radar development? Asked General Yoshijiro Umizu, Chief of the Army General Staff. Can we match their capability? Arasue shook his head. Our most advanced radar operates at wavelength 50 times longer than what the Americans appear to be using. We lack the industrial capacity to produce cavity magnetrons. We lack the scientific expertise to design comparable systems. We lack the time to develop them even if we had both. The Americans are 5 years ahead of us in radar technology, and that gap is widening. The admission hung in the air like the smoke outside. Over the following days, the pattern became clear. This wasn't a single raid. It was the beginning of a campaign. March 11th, Nagoya. 2074 B-29s delivered 1,190 tons of incendiaries. 3 square miles destroyed. 2,000 dead. American losses 1 aircraft. March 13th, Osaka. 2074 B-29s delivered 1,008 square miles destroyed. 4,000 dead. American losses 2 aircraft. March 16th, Kobe. 307 B-29s delivered 2,355 tons of incendiaries. 3 square miles destroyed. 8,000 dead. American losses 3 aircraft. March 19th, Nagoya again. 2090 B-29s delivered 103 square miles destroyed. American losses 1 aircraft. In 10 days, American radar-guided firebombing had destroyed 33 square miles of Japan's largest cities and killed over 114,000 civilians. The loss rate remained consistently below 3%, sustainable indefinitely. Japanese air defenses, despite desperate improvisations, achieved almost nothing. Night fighters scrambled blindly, occasionally finding targets by luck rather than systematic intercept. Anti-aircraft guns fired at radar contacts they couldn't track accurately. Searchlights swept empty sky while bombers passed overhead, invisible in the darkness. The technological disparity had become a strategic catastrophe. By April 1945, Japanese military planners understood they faced an enemy whose industrial and technological superiority made conventional defense impossible. A secret report prepared for the Supreme War Council laid out the grim reality. American radar-guided bombing has rendered our air defense system obsolete. We cannot intercept aircraft we cannot see. We cannot shoot down aircraft we cannot track. We cannot prevent attacks we cannot predict. The enemy operates with complete freedom in daylight and darkness, in clear weather and clouds. Our cities are defenseless. The recommendation was equally stark. Disperse all military production to underground facilities. Evacuate non-essential civilians from urban areas. Prepare for the complete destruction of every major city. But evacuation required transportation Japan no longer possessed. Underground construction required materials and labor Japan couldn't spare. The recommendations were sound but impossible to implement at the scale required. Meanwhile, the Americans were refining their tactics. Intelligence analysis showed that Japanese fighter opposition decreased with each raid, not because defenses were improving, but because they were being systematically destroyed. Every night fighter lost, every radar station bombed, every searchlight battery incinerated made the next raid easier. The Americans were grinding down Japanese air defense through simple attrition, backed by industrial capacity that could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. General Curtis LeMay, architect of the firebombing campaign, understood the mathematics perfectly. In a staff meeting on March 25, he laid out the strategy with brutal clarity. We have 63 cities targeted. Current sortie rate is 300 aircraft per raid, 3 raids per week minimum. At this rate, we can destroy every militarily significant Japanese city by August. Japanese fighter strength is declining 10% weekly. By June, organized air defense will effectively cease to exist. The prediction proved conservative. By May 1945, Japanese fighter opposition had collapsed so completely that B-29s began conducting daylight raids again, not because night bombing was less effective, but because there was no longer any meaningful difference in risk. The radar that had enabled the March 9 firestorm had given Americans complete air superiority, day and night in any weather conditions. The human cost was staggering. Between March and August 1945, American firebombing killed approximately 30,000 Japanese civilians and destroyed 78 square miles of urban area across 67 cities. Tokyo alone was hit 8 more times after March 9, each raid adding to the devastation. But the strategic impact extended beyond physical destruction. The systematic incineration of Japanese cities shattered civilian morale, disrupted military production, and forced the dispersal of resources Japan couldn't spare. Workers couldn't produce weapons while fleeing fires. Factories couldn't operate without workers. Transportation networks couldn't function when rail yards were burning. The B-29 campaign, enabled by radar technology Japan had dismissed as primitive, was strangling Japan's ability to continue the war more effectively than naval blockade or ground invasion could have achieved. Japanese technical experts, studying captured American radar equipment after the war, would be stunned by its sophistication. The cavity magnetron alone represented a level of precision manufacturing Japan couldn't match. The integrated radar bombsight system was years beyond anything Japanese engineers had conceived. The training manuals revealed systematic technical education that Japan's abbreviated wartime programs couldn't replicate. We were fighting the previous war, one Japanese radar engineer admitted in 1946. We improved what we had rather than inventing what we needed. The Americans leapfrogged entire generations of technology while we refined obsolete systems. By 1945, the technological gap was unbridgeable. The gap manifested in every aspect of operations. American B-29 crews flew missions with confidence born of technological superiority. They knew their radar would guide them to targets. They knew their equipment would function. They knew their training had prepared them for any contingency. Japanese defenders flew with the desperation of men fighting an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't track, couldn't stop. They scrambled knowing they probably wouldn't find targets. They fired knowing they probably wouldn't hit anything. They fought knowing each mission might be their last, and their sacrifice would achieve nothing. By July 1945, Japanese cities were being destroyed faster than they could evacuate. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Kokura, and Niigata, the cities ultimately considered for atomic bombing, had been deliberately spared from firebombing only because American planners wanted undamaged targets to assess atomic weapons' effectiveness. The irony was profound. These cities survived conventional bombing not because Japanese defenses protected them, but because American planners chose to spare them so they could destroy them more completely later. On the night of August 14, 1945, hours before Japan's surrender, 8 and 28 B-29s conducted the final firebombing raid of the war, hitting 7 cities simultaneously. Japanese radar tracked them all. Japanese fighters scrambled. Japanese guns fired. But the results were unchanged. The bombers found their targets through radar guidance, dropped their incendiaries with precision, and flew home safely. That final raid killed 1,000 more civilians and destroyed another square mile of urban area, demonstrating one last time that Japan had no answer to American technological supremacy. Lieutenant Commander Nakamura, who'd witnessed the March 9 firestorm from Tokyo's Air Defense Command Center, survived the war. In 1952, interviewed by American military historians, he reflected on that night, "We prepared to fight the enemy we expected, brave, determined but ultimately limited by the same technological constraints we faced. Instead, we encountered an enemy who had transcended those limitations. Their radar made darkness irrelevant. Their industrial capacity made our victories meaningless. Our best efforts achieved nothing against their technology. We didn't lose because we lacked courage. We lost because we underestimated how completely technology could rewrite the rules of warfare." By the time we understood what American radar could do, 100,000 Tokyoites were already dead. The March 9 firestorm hadn't just killed 100,000 people. It had demonstrated that modern warfare would be won not by fighting spirit or tactical brilliance, but by technological superiority backed by industrial capacity. Japan had entered the war believing that American technology was inferior, crude, mass-produced, lacking the refinement of Japanese precision engineering. The B-29's radar had proven that belief catastrophically wrong. The silver bombers that appeared over Tokyo on that March night, guided by radar Japan had dismissed as primitive, had rewritten the strategic balance of the Pacific War in 6 hours, and there had been nothing Japan could do to stop them. August 16, 1945. Tokyo Air Defense Command Center. Lieutenant Commander Toshio Nakamura stood alone on the observation platform where 5 months earlier he'd watched his city burn. The war had ended yesterday with the Emperor's radio broadcast, the first time most Japanese had heard their divine ruler's voice, announcing surrender in language so formal many couldn't understand it. Below him, Tokyo stretched toward the horizon, or what remained of it. Where Shitamachi had once stood, there was nothing but ash and occasional concrete foundations marking where buildings had been. 56 square miles of the capital had been incinerated across 9 major raids. The city that had been home to 8 million now sheltered perhaps 4 million. The rest evacuated, killed or fled to the countryside. The air still smelled of smoke. It had smelled of smoke since March. Nakamura's uniform hung loose on his frame. He'd lost 20 pounds since that first raid, subsisting on reduced rations in a city where food had become scarce, where water systems had been destroyed, where the basic infrastructure of civilization had been systematically burned away. His field telephone rang. One of the few lines still functioning. He picked it up mechanically. "Nakamura, Commander, this is Colonel Hayashi from General Headquarters. We're conducting post-war assessments. Your report on the March 9 attack, we need to understand what happened." How did they achieve such precision? Nakamura was silent for a moment, staring at the ruins. How did one explain complete technological defeat to men who still didn't understand? "Radar," he said finally. "Their radar could see through darkness as clearly as we see in daylight. Every aircraft knew exactly where it was. Every bombardier could identify his target without visual reference. They navigated 1,500 miles of open ocean, found a 3-mile target box in complete darkness, and placed 500,000 incendiaries within that box. They didn't get lucky, Colonel. They had a systematic technological advantage we couldn't counter. But our intelligence report said American radar was primitive. Our intelligence was wrong," Nakamura interrupted, too exhausted for politeness. "Catastrophically wrong. We assessed their technology based on equipment captured in 1943. We assumed they were refining existing systems the way we were. We had no concept that they were inventing entirely new categories of technology. By March 1945, their radar was so advanced it might as well have been magic." He hung up without waiting for a response. Footsteps on the metal stairs announced another visitor. Captain Kozaburo Yasui, the night fighter pilot who'd engaged the bombers on March 9, emerged onto the platform. He'd aged a decade in 5 months. His hair, jet black in March, was now streaked with grey. "I heard the war ended," Yasui said, joining Nakamura at the railing. "Seems pointless now, doesn't it? All those missions, all those pilots lost, and we never stopped a single raid. You shot down 4 B-29s, Nakamura offered. Yasui laughed bitterly. 4. Out of thousands that bombed Japan. And how many pilots did I lose? 16. We traded 16 trained pilots and their aircraft for 4 bombers the Americans replaced in a day. That's not combat. That's slaughter. They stood in silence, watching the sun rise over the ruins. In the distance, American transport aircraft were already arriving at Atsugi Airfield, bringing occupation troops to a nation that had believed itself unconquerable. I keep thinking about March 9th, Yasui continued. That first night, I got close enough to see one of their bombers clearly, close enough to count the rivets on its fuselage. I fired every round I had. I watched my shells hit, sparkles of impact all along the belly and wing, and the bomber just kept flying, dropped its incendiaries, flew away, like I hadn't even touched it. He turned to Nakamura. How do you fight an enemy like that? An enemy you can't see, can't track, can't damage even when you hit it. An enemy who operates with such precision that darkness means nothing, weather means nothing, distance means nothing. You don't, Nakamura said quietly. That's what we learned. You can't fight an enemy whose technology has made your tactics obsolete. You can be brave, skilled, determined. None of it matters when the enemy can see and you're blind. A young lieutenant emerged onto the platform carrying a folder. One of the junior officers who'd survived the command center's successive staff rotations as casualties mounted. Sir, the final casualty assessment. You asked for it. Nakamura took the folder, knowing what he'd find but needing to see it confirmed. He opened it slowly. B-29 raids on Japan, March-August 1945. Sorties flown 34,790 tons of incendiaries dropped tens and 4,000. Thousands is injured. Major cities attacked, 67 disti bound. B-29s lost to all causes 44 fine by 2% loss rate. B-29s lost to Japanese fighters 74 0.2% loss rate. The numbers told a story of complete air superiority achieved through technological dominance. The Americans had lost more aircraft to mechanical failure and weather than to Japanese defenses. They'd destroyed 78 square miles of Japanese cities while losing 44 fine bombers, a loss rate so low it was operationally irrelevant. Japanese fighter defenses, despite desperate courage and sacrifice, had achieved almost nothing. 414. Yasui read over Nakamura's shoulder. They lost 444 Fond bombers over 6 months. We lost 1,500 fighters in the same period. They were replacing losses faster than we could inflict them, while every pilot we lost was irreplaceable. Nakamura closed the folder. The Emperor spoke of a new and most cruel bomb, the atomic weapons. But those killed 200,000 in 2 cities. Conventional firebombing killed 30,000 across 67 cities. The new and cruel weapon wasn't the atomic bomb, it was radar-guided incendiary bombing. That's what defeated us. No, a new voice said from the stairway. Major General Kawabe emerged onto the platform, his uniform still bearing the insignia of Tokyo Air Defense Commander, a position that had become meaningless by May. What defeated us was our arrogance, our assumption that American technology was inferior, our belief that fighting spirit could overcome material superiority. He joined them at the railing, looking out over the ruins of his city. I read the intelligence reports from 1943, Kawabe continued. The ones that dismissed American radar as primitive. I approved defensive plans based on the assumption that night bombing was impossible. I assured the Supreme War Council that low-altitude attacks would result in catastrophic American losses. I was wrong about everything. We all were, Nakamura said. The entire military leadership underestimated American technological capacity. We thought we were fighting the enemy we'd faced in 1941. Brave but industrially crude. We didn't realize they'd created an entirely new form of warfare. Kawabe pulled a document from his uniform pocket, creased and worn from repeated reading. This is a translation of an American document we captured. A training manual for B-29 radar operators. The level of detail is extraordinary. They have systematic procedures for identifying terrain features, distinguishing cities from countryside, locating specific buildings. They trained their operators for 12 weeks before combat, 12 weeks learning to read radar screens. He handed the manual to Nakamura. We had no equivalent training. Our radar operators learned on the job, if they learned at all. We treated radar as a tool, they treated it as a weapons system. The three men stood in silence as the sun climbed higher, warming the ash-covered ruins below. In the distance, smoke still rose from areas where fires smoldered in basements and underground spaces. Fires that had been burning since the last raid 3 days ago. What happens now? Yasui asked. We rebuild, Kawabe said. Under American occupation, following American guidance, perhaps we'll learn what we should have understood years ago, that modern warfare isn't won by spirit or tactics alone. It's won by technology, industry, and the scientific application of force. Nakamura thought of the 100,000 who died on March, the families incinerated together in houses that became furnaces, the citizens who jumped into boiling rivers, the children who'd suffocated in air raid shelters when firestorms consumed all oxygen. He thought of the 250,000 more who died in subsequent raids, across cities that had believed themselves defensible until American radar proved otherwise. My son asks me why we lost, Nakamura said quietly. He's 8 years old. He wants to know why his home burned, why his school is gone, why his friends died. What do I tell him? Tell him the truth, Kawabe replied. We lost because we underestimated our enemy. We saw their radar equipment and called it primitive without understanding they were already building the next generation. We dismissed their technology as crude mass production without recognizing that mass production backed by scientific innovation is a weapon we couldn't match. We fought bravely and achieved nothing because courage without technology is just theater. Will he understand? Yasui asked. He'll have to, Kawabe said. His generation will rebuild Japan. They'll need to understand that the world has changed, that technology now determines military outcomes more than any other factor, that the nation which innovates fastest, produces most efficiently and applies science most ruthlessly will dominate warfare. An American C-54 transport aircraft flew overhead, low enough that they could see the White Star insignia on its wings. It was heading toward Atsugi, carrying more occupation forces to a Japan that had believed itself unconquerable. I wonder if they understand, Nakamura said, watching the aircraft disappear toward the horizon. The Americans, do they understand what their radar did, that it didn't just guide bombers, it revolutionized warfare? That March 9th wasn't just a raid, but a demonstration that technology had made traditional defenses obsolete. They understand, Kawabe said. That's why they won. They understood before we did that the next war would be won by scientists and engineers as much as soldiers. They invested in radar when we invested in fighting spirit. They built industrial research complexes while we refined old tactics. They created new forms of warfare while we perfected old ones. He turned to face them both. The question is, will future generations learn the lesson, or will they repeat our mistake? Dismissing new technology, underestimating enemies, believing that determination can overcome material disadvantage. No one had an answer. As the morning light strengthened, revealing the full scope of devastation below, Nakamura remembered standing on this same platform on March 9th, watching the eastern horizon glow white-orange, feeling the heat from fires 10 kilometers away, realizing too late that everything had changed. The silver bombers, guided by radar, had rewritten the rules of warfare in 6 hours, but Japan's leadership had needed 5 more months and 78 square miles of ashes to accept what that March night had proven. Technology backed by industrial capacity and scientific innovation now determined military outcomes more than courage, tactics, or fighting spirit. It was a lesson written in fire, across 67 Japanese cities. A lesson that had cost 33,000 lives to learn. Nakamura folded the casualty report carefully and placed it in his pocket. Someday, historians would study these numbers, would analyze the strategic implications, would debate the ethics and necessity of the firebombing campaign. But for now, standing in the ruins of his city, watching American aircraft circle overhead with impunity, he understood only this: Japanese commanders had underestimated American radar, and Tokyo had burned.